would like to introduce the panelists who I'm just so pleased are here to join me. I think most of you know who they are, and it's probably why you're here. So thank you for agreeing to talk with us today, and also tacking this onto Art Fair weekend. A lot of us are probably happy to be sitting down right now. If you've been going to the Art Fair, it's really nice to have a moment where we're not exercising. But I want to talk about serendipity and how I came to meet Colleen and Marc. Marc and I met while stuck at LaGuardia Airport, trying to get out of New York to get back to Toronto, and if you've done that run before, you're almost always delayed. And I had the director of the National Gallery of Canada cornered. And my first experience, truly, he wasn't going anywhere, neither was I, and got to talking about Jack Bush, which is how the retrospective exhibition, in many ways, was born. Marc was having some pressure on his end to really celebrate core modern Canadian art, and then I had my own scholarship interests. But what I discovered in Marc is somebody, never mind that he's leading the National Gallery of Canada, and what a wonderful gallery it is, but somebody who really truly looks at art, loves art, and so it was a great kinship. Now, before I had met Marc, I had read his catalog where he put together the Jean-Michel Basquiat show for the Brooklyn Museum. Before Brooklyn, Marc had been directing the Power Plant. He's also had acted as a curator at the Albright Knox, which is really a great place to cut your teeth on abstract art, I have to say. And he's had really an illustrious career. But I love that Basquiat catalog. I went to buy it, and it was out of print, and I remember waiting for it. Just really remarkable, thoughtful work. So my meeting Marc and the evolution of the retrospective was pretty lucky, I'll say. And then there was some luck involved in Naomi Potter, who deserves so many thanks for really thinking about bringing Jack Bush and Colleen Heslin's work together. And that serendipitous moment happened in the sense that she knew that she was going to do or look out to find a curator to do a Jack Bush show and mount a Jack Bush show. But because the mandate of Esker Foundation in Calgary is really focused on living artists, this is a challenge for her. Who would she reach out to be a kind of conversation with Jack Bush? And I think she would agree that the serendipitous moment was having a Jack Bush, the retrospective catalog out and getting to know his work, and flipping through a Border Crossings magazine and happening upon Colleen Heslin's work. And I remember you calling me and saying, you've got to see this. I don't even know that I have to say much about it, just see the connection between the works that are happening here, that it was natural, that you could also see that Colleen wasn't at all derivative of Jack Bush, but was pushing another envelope, and that's, I think, what we would like to talk about here. Now, Colleen, as I've been getting to know her, when I first met you, it was really my favorite time when I was at Esker, and I was there to install the show, but I spent a lot of time with Colleen, and Les Ramsey was there, another artist, and also Etienne Zach was there, and I was with a room full of young artists, and we were talking about the practice of abstract art. I remember this really well. Truly, never mind the talks and the 1,400 people who came to the opening at Esker when we launched Jack Bush in Studio and Needles and Pins. My favorite time of that show was standing in a room with young artists who were really turned on by Jack Bush, but also turned on by their own work. So that, to me, I think speaks volumes, and I hope that you're enjoying seeing Colleen's work. And as I know, and it's why I invited Marc, Marc's a great speaker. So without further ado, and knocking over my kid here, this is a big responsibility. How do we talk about legacies of Jack Bush, or how do we go about this? And for me, and I know for Colleen and Marc as well, we're not going to do a sort of here's a Bush slide, here's a Colleen Heslin slide. We'd really like to talk about abstract art in general and what that means. So of course I love writing, but I love nothing more than looking at art, and it's one of the reasons, like I said, that I admire Marc, is because he really does look. And for me, with Jack Bush, my scholarship began, people say, how did you begin doing the catalog raisonné or working on these exhibitions? It was being in a room of about 10 Jack Bush paintings in a private collection. One room was hung with 10 works by the artist, and it was the chance to be able to stand in front of Jack's work and feel that work and really register with it, body to canvas. And I think, certainly in my experience of going through a PhD and a postdoc, there was not a single class about looking at art. And it's one of the reasons why we have an artist here, because that's what they do for a living. And I wanted to start by talking about the importance of Jack's work, not just seeing it in a book, but actually seeing it in person. Marc, can you relate any of your experience of discovering Jack's work?
There's a huge difference between a representation, a photograph of Jack Bush painting, and the actual physical presence, but there's a huge difference between the representation of any work of art and being in its physical presence. There's an enormous difference. You're now aware of the scale, the texture, the actual colors, the relation with other things around it, etc., that you don't have when you're looking at a representation. And there are so many wonderful stories about artists who were influenced by other artists who they'd only seen in representation in magazines and made pretty fundamental errors about what they presumed about that work. And then when they see them, there's the famous story of the artists in Vancouver who were quite enchanted with Frank Stella's work, only to find out years later when they saw Frank Stella painting that they were painted by hand, whereas these guys thought they were taped. And so they were using masking tape to get nice clean lines, and when they saw an actual Frank Stella, there are no clean lines, not at all. You have to see something in person, and particularly, I think, in Colleen's work, with the subtlety of the relationships of the colors and the shapes are things that don't get translated, and also the stitching and the tension between the various parts that make up the painting. You don't see that tension at all in a representation, so it's pretty fundamental.
I'm going to show the next slide, which is another exhibition of Colleen's work that was at Monty Clark Gallery in Vancouver in September, called Somatic Traditions. And I was saying to Colleen over brunch that Jack Bush really aimed to go pow, pow, pow with his works. He wanted to knock people over. And my experience with your work, Colleen, is I'm drawn to it in a sort of slow manner. So you have that initial visual impression, and then I feel like your work is a little more approachable. It's not knocking me over, and then I feel drawn into it. Do you think about that, the experience of the viewer when you're making your work?
Yeah, but it's mostly guided by my own interests in terms of where any particular space that is, or sensibility or attitude that's resonating for me. So I think it's really important in my practice to shift through, like the change is really important. So I think that with this exhibition, it occurring after showing with Bush, there was this real sense of a departure in a way, a departure from color, and a higher interest in working with just the more subtle nuances that were happening.
Let me show the next slide here. Naomi, do you think that this was a work that was in Border Crossings? This is Colleen's Yesterday's Parties. It's ink and dye on sewn cotton. It's about 84 inches by 60 inches. This is the kind of work, I think, that triggered right away the relationship to Jack Bush's work, who was stacking color and making these ladders. And one of the conversations that we've had in preparing for this talk is, how does Colleen's work fit in contemporary tendencies to refer to the past? There was a panel talk at Art Toronto on Friday about this sense of interesting words that I think need to be thought about more. The sense of mentorship, whether artists are thinking about historical artists gone past as something to look up to, although I think mentorship is a two-way path, or legacies or loaded words, or just simply a response or an influence to. We were talking about some of the differences that we find in Colleen's work.
Well, I'd like to hear Colleen on this, because it is true that there's a different relationship that occurs in a paradigm-like abstraction, in a mode, in a grammar-like abstraction that has gone back well over a century now, where each generation that contributes to this idea is contributing in a different way and is relating to the previous generation in a different way. And what I find unique, perhaps perhaps not unique, but particular to your generation, Colleen, if I may, is that there's no irony involved. It's not a commentary, it's more of an extension of a previous mode of working that hasn't been exhausted. And that there's more to say, and to say in different language, but you're not commenting on it like the generation previous to yours that was ironic, that was commenting directly on the what we call the golden age of mid-century abstraction. Is that a deliberate decision on your part to not be ironic and to be more sympathetic or empathetic, really, with those much older abstract artists?
I think it's partly just exercising a freedom of thinking and making in the studio, and not necessarily a whole. I think that we're in a moment where there's so much work to reflect on. There's so many conversations that have happened, but also curiously, abstraction is relatively new comparatively. If you look at the larger span of painting and art history, and there has been, it almost is like it had this opportunity to exist for 50 years, and then was dated because so much of the work that happened from that was a rejection or just a pushing off from that, and having the opportunity to see how artists have interacted with that, and also relating very much to my own experience and the contemporary moment, and also living through the birth of the digital age. All of these factors are playing a part in, I think, this new generation of artists that are interested, that are re-engaging with material in a way, because it's not necessarily a given, because there's so many opportunities to work. And I think there's also a particular moment of visual saturation that we have in this day, where, especially with representation in the media and whatnot, and I think that with that again, offering abstraction to view is a very different cognitive experience for the viewer than a very specific image is, in terms of how to read the image. And so I am particularly interested in generating that cognitive activity, but also the images being more mutable and not fixed in terms of the reading is also important to me, because I think that opens up a broader conversation as well.
Well, this is particularly interesting, and I'm going to tease this out a little bit more with you, because the criticism of mid-century abstraction by a lot of younger artists in the 60s and particularly in the 70s, it got even more extreme in the 70s, is that this is bankrupt, navel-gazing, shirking your social responsibilities, that artists have to participate in our society and solving problems, etc. And what are all these self-indulgent pretty pictures? This actually goes back to the 19th century and the argument, not direct argument, but indirect argument, between Tolstoy and Mallarmé, and the French poets who were making beautiful poems, but fairly incomprehensible in Mallarmé's case, about playing with language, where Tolstoy is saying, you have a social responsibility. What are the right moral decisions? Write a novel that shows what the wrong moral decision is and what the right moral decision. You have a responsibility. Today, what you've just said that I find so interesting is, with not only the saturation of images, but images that are always trying to get our attention and to get us to think one way or think another, we do need escapism. We do need to take a vacation, a cognitive vacation, from this world of ours that is in our hand and an extension of our brain. So do you feel this as your social responsibility, is to create that escape?
Well, I think that in the early stages of this work developing, one artist that really resonated with me was Agnes Martin, and the way that she speaks about her, especially where she had gotten to in her practice in the later years, and that's really interesting to me, looking at the whole, like, just that span And because I think hearing her speak at the end of her career with that experience behind her, and she does talk about this sense of being able to turn your back to the world and to really enter into your own, which I think is really important at times. And I think that we are in this moment where there is no one particular way of making work, and we all, I think as an artist, you only have the responsibilities that you give yourself. And if you feel responsible for a certain issue, then that, or interested, and that is a freedom to address that not all artists have. But also, there is this pressure, and I think at that moment, historically, especially if you look at a period like abstract expressionism, the way that there's points where it's reflected on, like people were saying that it was like funded by the CIA as a way of it being like this empty space, and they didn't want culture to be reflected, and almost not different than what would have happened in the funding into media in the Depression area, where everybody's the show tunes and everybody's smiling. But then again, when you look at abstraction, and if it's generating, like children are very drawn to abstraction, and there's this expansive allure, and if there is something I think thinking is very important, and I think it's something that can generate cognition, but also that also depends on how strong the work of art is, and not all work is going, like not all abstract, and also what an individual is responding to, not everybody responds to. So I'm interested in observing how people respond to work, but I also am more just interested in exercising my freedom in terms of what allowing myself to make what is of the most interest to me in that moment.
And what I wanted to say is that sense of personal liberty is what really made Jack Bush love painting as an abstract artist. It was what his psychotherapist had said to him when he first suggested an abstract method for the artist, is let yourself go. Just let, no preconceived ideas, just let yourself think about color and form and shape, just let go. And when I have taught Canadian art specifically, but also generally, I've had to teach minimalism. Was the very first course I ever had to teach, which was a nightmare.
You can teach that?
Yes, it was very daunting. And what I discovered is that very younger generations, I guess we can call them millennials, because they're in an information age that is predominantly image-based, Instagram, all the social media outlets are very focused on images. They are completely raised to feel that all images contain some sort of form of data, like there's consumption of information via images. And so when they're confronted often with historical abstraction, or I often make them watch Jack Chambers' Heart of London film, it's very hard for them to contend with what I call, and I don't mean this in a demeaning sense, visual boredom. It's okay to be bored or not be fed information while engaging with a work of art. It's okay to just let your mind be. You're not processing information, but I'm finding that very younger generations have a hard time. So what I do is I either play Michael Snow's Wavelength, or I'll play Jack Chambers' Heart of London, and I'll say to them, all right, we're going to run this. They're very long films. You're welcome to leave if you want, or you're welcome to stay. 9 times out of 10, I have about 2 students at the end that can take it. They can't actually physically take sitting in a room for 45 minutes or more and not have some sense of a narrative storyline or some sort of piece of information coming at them. But there was a moment with artists like Helen Frankenthaler and Jack Bush where it was just about pure optical delight in many ways, that it was okay to do that. And I put Tutti Frutti up here because when we do make these comparisons of Colleen's work to Jack Bush's work, we have to also look and acknowledge the fact that Frankenthaler means something to Colleen. I've heard her say this, so I can say that. And that this sort of soak stain technique was largely born from Helen Frankenthaler. And in 1952, she did a masterful work called Mountains and Sea, in fact inspired by the Canadian Maritimes. And that 1952 soak stain painting was something that struck artists like Morris Lewis, who would go on to Pour Works, and Kenneth Noland. They had seen the work in '53 in her studio. And so that kind of preliminary heritage, especially when often Colleen can be described as a female abstract artist. I mean, she's an abstract artist, but we have to understand the roots of this, that even back in the 50s and 60s, there were women artists inspiring some of what we know as capital M, you know, macho modern artists. So I wanted to show the Frankenthaler work here, and then follow it up by an image that many of you may know, which I find to be interesting, especially in hindsight. So this is Helen Frankenthaler in 1956. One photo from a photo shoot done by Gordon Parks for Life magazine. Mark, when I sent you the slide list, this was the one that jumped out at you?
Well, because I'd never seen this image before, and because we have to remember that you talk about macho modernism, but Helen Frankenthaler was the leader of this group. She was one of the she was the one that the boys were imitating. She was the one who inspired Jack Bush in that first show that he wanted to do for New York, in his very first exhibition in New York. And Clement Greenberg said, your pictures look too much. There you go. They look too much like Helen Frankenthaler. People are going to notice this right away. Well, all the other color field artists were also looking at Helen Frankenthaler and trying to process what she was doing, because this idea of flatness that Clement Greenberg kept talking about, it's a two-dimensional surface with paint on it. That's what a painting is. And so that's all it should be, really. It should express its ontological basic existence. And so Frankenthaler said, okay, well, if it's flat, then the color and the canvas should be the same surface. It should be a colored canvas, which of course you've done, taken that one step further, but you're constructing your images. This idea, of course, just went like wildfire all around the young artists who were working in her region. I think that we need to be looking at a lot more women abstract painters from this period who've been relegated to storage, because there's a language there and a contribution that has been misunderstood, and I think that we're ready now to look at these paintings again and stop calling them second-rate and start thinking about them a little bit more seriously. Helen Frankenthaler, unfortunately, suffered the slings and arrows they were the last generation of authentic, sincere abstract artists. And then there was the great reform that art had to take responsibility. We're looking at where all of the liberation movements are happening at this time, and art seems to be disconnected. It's a long legacy. It goes back to Piet Mondrian. When you think that Piet Mondrian's paintings were made during the First and the Second World War, you would never know that the world was at war. You would never know there was enormous social upheavals when you look at his paintings. The same thing's going on with color field. You would never know that the world is changing, that people have had enough of the old system. It's not in the art. Anyway, I think I've exhausted that subject, but it's very interesting to me now to look at work that we haven't been looking at because the boys took over and got under the floodlights, and looking at women painters from the 19th century, and women painting women in the 19th century. Everybody knows about Prudence Heward, but there were all of these women working before her. The same thing with abstraction. I think that it's probably time now. I'm sure you both agree with me, and Colleen probably most of all. It's time to look at our female predecessors in recent art history. It's going to be very, very helpful.
Yeah, and there are a lot of shows that are being mounted currently, looking back at, and texts and books being published on these women who worked at the Grace Hardigan. And Lee Krasner was getting more attention to her work in the 80s than she was in that moment. And there are enough women of that time that you could teach a lecture just looking at that work, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that history is in the present starting to be rewritten by historians looking back at these artists.
This is not to denigrate Jack Bush, however, who, as we've demonstrated, was looking at women painters.
Oh, definitely. I mean, he acknowledged it in his diaries. This painting here on the screen is called Bouquet. It dates to the 28th of May, 1960. And it was in April 1960 that he had gone to New York and seen a Helen Frankenthaler show and really just wrote about how turned on he was by it, this sort of seamless union between pigment and the raw sailcloth and what that meant to him. And he felt compelled to come home and to paint these. In the end, though, he didn't feel brave enough to lead out for his first solo show in New York with these floral works. And in fact, as some of you had seen the retrospective, discovered that the retrospective in 2014 was the first time these floral works were actually ever shown publicly. So I think it's interesting.
Well, he was strongly advised not to show them in public because they seemed to be continuing an idea that wasn't his, that was Helen Frankenthaler.
And that they were simply, I think, too pretty. And that's interesting because I think Jack was a very conscious artist. It's one of the reasons I was attracted to his work. He was always thinking about how he would be perceived even far into the future, by leaving his diaries behind and asking that they might be used by a future historian. And I think that sometimes, and I was discussing with people at the art fair who, they have a hard time immediately liking Jack Bush. It's sort of, they don't like it at first, and there's a saying that says the first time you see a Jack Bush painting is the worst time. But they grow on you, and
quickly.
Naomi Potter acknowledged this, that when she was living with the Jack Bush paintings at Esker Foundation, at first it was sort of okay, but then over time they really do grow on you. But I do think that the artist, in many of his works, aimed to be a little bit disruptive and not be so pretty. Like when you see that downstairs in Mayburst, that green next to that green, it's just not pretty to do that. But what it does is it bothers you and it brings you back. Just like there might be a strange dye line where you think you're seeing three-dimensional or you're seeing sort of more surface or texture in Colleen's work, but then you go back because you're sort of sensing, I need to see this for myself and get up close. So I think. Well,
this brings me to another question I wanted to ask you, Colleen, because up to about 2015, your works are, the actual elements in them are dyed differently. They have a different effect. There's the crinkling. It's very much about the fabric and about fabricness. And the way they're arranged, it almost looks like an abstract collage of photographs of fabric. It's something that people often say. Yeah, that's one version. There's another beautiful one that is up there from 2015. And then you stop this year, I guess, 2016, where it's all about the dye, and it's not about the fabric. The fabric seems to be very neutral, the canvas, and it's the aberrations in the dye as opposed to the aberrations in textile. Can you tell us why you changed, why you became even flatter in that regard and stopped this illusion?
Yeah, originally when I was, there's a couple works in the show that were the early works that were made for this exhibition, where I was still working with the ink, and it was the Indian ink that was giving me, through some experiments I had done, and I've worked with photography a lot and in dark rooms, and I saw that it was this very simple image that was developing, that the process was simple, and that those observations were really important to me, to have a process that was like economical and accessible, and where I was learning from experiments and pushing the experiments. And and I had just moved a studio, and the work was getting larger, and I think that I was interested in working with flatness and engaging with a field of color, and I found that texture was a bit overbearing for me, and so there was a point where it was really interesting in terms of more of an it was relating to, it was pointing at different mediums, which was important to me, because with his works there were a lot of questions about hierarchy of medium and material and labor, like this play between painting and sewing, domestic labor, professional practice, but also bringing photography into that was also interesting to me. And there was a point where it was where I really do just follow my interests, and I think when change is happening in your studio, to bring something new into the work, you have to let go of something, and that was what I let go of when I started this work. So this is the first large body of work that I made. Like, I was working through this change. So working on the show, it was a bit start and stop, and then things really generated near the end. But because it was a new, and that holds my interest as an artist, that change that I bring into the studio.
Well, can we talk about change? Because change was also an element in Jack Bush's career, one that he was criticized for by Clement Greenberg, because he didn't exhaust each series that he worked on, and Greenberg kept saying, why are you making just 5 of these? You should be making 35 of them. And he said, no, my doctor told me it couldn't be like work. It has to be more like play. And this is therapy, it's not production. So once I've figured it out, I'm moving on, because I don't want it to feel like work. So that was his dynamic for change, but yours seems to be different.
But I heard, when I heard you speaking on Friday, I heard you speaking in terms of you like to meet a challenge and kind of work out the issues, and then can I assume that once you feel like you maybe have worked that out, that you want to seek out another challenge, or?
Well, for me, making work and seeing work, I find the most interesting work I see is work where I can see somebody figuring something out, and once it's been resolved, then it can sometimes fall into that production or reproduction of something that has, and so there is this place between not knowing and knowing that space is very important, because there's different cognitive activity that ends up translating from your thoughts into that work, and that sense of tension is really important for in the engagement in the object, and objects do hold a sense and a telling of their making, and so it's not just about the material and the formal considerations, but also all of the conceptual motivations and considerations and cognitive,
I think sometimes it's revealed in titles.
Sure.
So I want to show, we have this one here, Odalise, Hey Hey Frankenthaler. Now that's quite a title. This is something that came to mind. And then there's a work that the National Gallery recently acquired. Here, Jonathan Lasker's The Universal Frame of Reference. Again, Mark, do you want to speak about this?
Well, this artist is from the generation before yours, Colleen, whose work is a commentary on the generation before his, or maybe a little bit more. And what he's done is he's fused these two opposite positions, the very classic opposite positions in abstraction, the what we will call, let's say, the Dionysian approach to art making that you see with Jackson Pollock, or the 10th Street touch. Jackson Pollock, that whole generation of artists really making the big gestural paintings that look more like athleticism than actual composition, and very much very physical, very spontaneous, and a little bit out of control. And then the Apollonian, shall we say, a little bit more anal approach of someone like Pete Mondrian, where you're being very careful and it's rectilinear and very correct and very controlled. It's just the opposite. And he's married those two. So there's a lot of humor in this, but you have to know your art history very well to see the humor. So in the areas, it's very, very thickly painted also. So they have the factor of it is exaggerated. They're very, very thick. It's a very thick painting, or extremely flat painting. The black lines are flush. They're very, very flat, as if they were done with magic markers. And then the colored ones are extremely thick, as if they're almost sculptural elements that were stuck on the canvas. They're ironic. They're referring to the history of abstraction directly. They're a commentary. And that's what I wanted to point out, is that your generation seems to, or you, I can't speak for your whole generation. There are a lot of ironists among you as well. But seems to have a different relationship than this generation with abstraction, wanting to extend. And also there's another element, something that I've seen, a lot of the women who've been working in abstraction anachronistically, as if they were the missing artists from abstract expressionism. I think of Louise Fishman, for example, and a few artists like that, whereas as far as you go into the future, people will forget that these were done 20, 30, and 40 years later. But there is an opportunity to include more women in the history of abstraction, in those particular modes of abstraction, even though they're anachronistic. It's almost as if we're filling in the absence of women by continuing that practice from their perspective. This is something that I have observed that may or may not be correct, but it's interesting to me. What do you think of this notion?
Well, I think,
and are you one of those women?
Well, I think it's always, there's always a struggle in terms of how there's so many different, again, like ways of working or speaking about your work, and I find abstract painting can be a very difficult form to speak about. And we're having this conversation, but as an artist and as contemporary artists, sometimes when you have a project that is more research-based, it's easier to, there's more specific references to point at, whereas with abstraction, there's this discomfort with speaking about formalism, because formalism is often seen as that historic part of that.
Especially in Vancouver.
Yeah, and also that is another context to my practices, is most of my time I've spent in Vancouver as an artist, and there wasn't a lot of painting being shown at that in Vancouver, but there's always histories there, and there always has, and so there's always painters, and there's always there's these practices that continue whether or not there is attention or light on that. And I think that what's happening right now is that space is opening up for a range of work to exist, and there's new platforms and contexts for a wider range of works, and it allows artists to suddenly engage with material and modes of working that they're particularly interested in, because there is at points, periods, where there's a huge if there's a strong rejection of something, it can be very difficult to work within that. But I think also counter to that, it's equally difficult to be working when there's an abundance. I think that there was a moment in time where having a large group, and I think that the peers are very important, and we do carry on conversations, and you learn a lot, and through that, but I think there's something that happens, I find, within art where once we have, again, that very low attention span at times, and once something becomes oversaturated or over-presented, we crave something different. And I think that we're experiencing that with painting right now, where we're seeing this discussion of this shift from abstraction to figuration. And when this new abstraction has been getting a lot of attention, you have this, which is also very exciting. You have this pushback again from that with this, and I think I'm particularly interested in how different mediums and modes of working can inform each other, and not. I find it very important to look outside of painting and the history of painting within my own practice.
You're looking at quilts.
I'm looking at quilts. I'm looking at craft. I'm looking at a range of works.
I think what many people don't know is Colleen also practices as an independent curator, which, am I correct? Yes? Yes. So you have a respect for conversations and a sensitivity to platforms, that something somewhere means something there, and then shifting it to another location or a different type of venue, or an exhibition that opens at the National Gallery takes on a different